Greetings, everyone. I'm really excited to welcome Professor Kathleen Cruz Gutierrez here today, especially because her work resonates with so many of the exciting conversations that are going on at Yale and elsewhere at the intersection of environmental humanities, Southeast Asian studies, history, and of course, in my own field of anthropology, where everyone is talking about the entanglements of plants and humans, as well as science and technology studies, which Dr. Gutierrez is deeply involved in. She's working at the forefront of all of these fields and using the critical study of the history of botanical science to rethink a range of assumptions about Philippines' history, ideas of region in Southeast Asia, not to mention just region, but how Southeast Asianists themselves imagine the idea of Southeast Asia itself, and the role of science in imperial and nationalist formations. I think there's a lot of conversations to have between faculty at UC Santa Cruz, where she has recently taken up a position as assistant professor, and all of us here at Yale. And I hope this conversation today will be just the first of many to come. I want to say a little bit about her recent dissertation. In my course on the politics of culture in Southeast Asia, we read and discussed this brilliant piece of work, The Region of Imperial Strategy. And we had a vibrant discussion, and all of us in the class found it to be extremely multi-layered. And in the course, I asked students to write book reviews of the works we read, and I thought it would be appropriate to quote from one such review written by Orvin Mallory, who is here. You could see Orvin there. I didn't know Orvin would be here, but a brilliant undergraduate student who actually is majoring in a STEM field, but interested in the Philippines and Southeast Asia and Southeast Asian studies. So I'm just going to read one paragraph. I hope you don't mind, Orvin. I've just snatched a paragraph from your brilliant review. Orvin writes, "In the region of imperial strategy, Kathleen Gutierrez asks us to move the kaleidoscope through which we have been viewing the history of the Philippines, if only slightly, in a way that brings the unexpectedly rich story of botany into the political history of the nation. In doing so, we pry open an unseen network of individuals and institutions ripe with new stories to tell. Seeing Filipino history bound through Prescott's paradigm, the seemingly unconscious division of a pre-1898 and post-1898 Philippines, Gutierrez seeks to uproot this tyranny of historiography to portray the role of scientific collaboration in fostering the makings of an inter-imperial hegemony of thought. For Gutierrez, the Philippines is not merely a peripheral figure in the arena of European imperialism's decline at the start of the 20th century, but a central hub of it. The seeds of post-imperial and post-colonial logics were not planted in the halls of Versailles or the International Botanical Congress, but within the letters sent from the gardens of Manila." I think it's such a beautiful evocation of this rich tapestry of science and technology studies, Southeast Asian studies, that we encounter in Professor Gutierrez's dissertation. And so I just want to use that as a window to open us into today's conversation. Today's discussion will be sort of a talk show format. And so I want to build from Orvin's introduction to the dissertation there and ask Professor Gutierrez to tell us a little bit more about this dissertation, The Region of Imperial Strategy. You describe a series of Spanish era and then American era botanical texts, and then you use these to make an argument about the emergence of a kind of botanical science that transforms Philippine history. So I wondered if you could just tell us a little bit about some of these texts and some of the actors that you so brilliantly discuss in the dissertation, and how you mobilize those to get us to think in new ways about the Philippines, Southeast Asia, and other things.
Sure. Thank you so much. And thanks for the introduction. Orvin, that was amazing. Very generous of you in your description of it. And I think you really hit the nail on the head. I mean, so much of the genesis of the dissertation came from this problem. What's happening around 1898? Why is science especially projected in this way, in which we have sort of the Spanish imperial backwater, and then we have the US progressive period in Philippine history. And I wanted to just investigate it a little bit more, see what was going on, see what was actually salient, and then find where there was something divergent. And it came down to botany. And so if you sort of muddy 1898 as this strict division in Philippine colonial history, you actually see quite a bit of similarity across the two botany projects under the Spanish and the US. And so by looking at certain texts, I was able to find that one of those things that muddies 1898 is this preoccupation with the region, this idea of the Philippines being a part of a floristic region. And so there were Spanish botanists who were invested in that, and there were US botanists invested in this as well. And so by way of texts, one of the texts I look at during the Spanish era is this 1883 publication by Sebastian Vidal, who's this Catalan botanist, perhaps the most famous secular Spanish botanist in the late 19th century in the Philippines. It's illustrated with Regino Garcia, who's a local illustrator, a Filipino local illustrator. And they're really interested in putting the Philippines flora in conversation with other flora from island Southeast Asia, or what would become island Southeast Asia. The same is happening in the US period, particularly with the work of Elmer D. Merrill, who's perhaps the most well-known US colonial botanist that we have in Philippine history. And he's working on regional flora slowly while he's in the Philippines. He's looking at Indochina, he's looking at the Indian subcontinent, he's looking at Ambon in the Dutch East Indies, and he's putting the Philippines in conversation with regional flora as well. And so for me, I'm really curious in the dissertation about what exactly is connecting this intellectual trend. And I argue that in part it's happening as a result of kind of how botany is internationalizing and becoming sort of this neo-imperial formation of international collaboration. And one of those strategies is through region building. And flora becomes a really great determining platform for this in island Southeast Asia, but what we would really, again, consider the broader region. You asked about people, Erik, and so I divide the dissertation through these stories of three individuals. Regino Garcia, who I mentioned, is this illustrator who also is kind of known as a botanist who learns it on the job, even though he doesn't have formal training. Sebastian Vidal, the secular Spanish botanist, who even though is really famous in the Philippines at the end of the 19th century, his career gets eclipsed in the historiography in many ways, I think, because there's this focus on US imperial science that clouds what's happening during the Spanish period. And then my third main actor is Mary Strong Clemens, who is a US plant collector. She collects all throughout what would become Southeast Asia. And so I follow her career a little bit through the Philippines. And by looking at her career, I'm able to open up conversations about local collectors in the Philippines who are also contributing to botany at the time. And what I love about these people is that their careers overlap. Some of them collaborate with one another. Some of them mention each other in their correspondence. And they really help, again, sort of muddy 1898. I think when you follow actors who are just kind of pushing aside a periodization for a moment in our narratives and allowing us to see what other dynamic configurations are happening intellectually at the time.
Thank you, Kathleen. I have this book actually that, because when I read your dissertation, I looked in the Yale library. This is the one by Vidal y Soler, Plantas Lenosas de Filipinas, and it's the one. And I'm also sharing with the group the names of those people because I have it in my notes from reading your dissertation, so people can have those names. But if I open this, I'm just curious, if I open this and show it to the group, I don't know if people can see. Can people see this when I share this? Can you just say what it's like to encounter this in the archive and how opening a book like this reveals something about Philippine history? It's really, I was trying to communicate this with the students in my class, but I hadn't yet got the book from the library yet. It took a couple days to get it. And I'm just curious, like there's these archival materials, right, that are in all these libraries around the world, and hidden in them is these kind of hidden stories. So I wonder if you could unpack that a little bit. In the encounter with one of the plates, because there's something in your dissertation as well, the way in which you attend to the drawings, and there's like a kind of almost an archive inscribed into the drawings themselves, right? I wondered if you
Yeah,
could expand on that a little bit.
definitely. Yeah, thank you so much for bringing the text out. And, I have to admit that part of my investigation began with Vidal. He sort of left behind the best archive from this period in Philippine history, and it's all in Madrid. But what I was starting to discover as I was looking through Vidal's archive was this sort of peripheral character who would just emerge, this Regino Garcia, who he collected with, who took him around the Philippines. Somehow his resume, right, where we would have the resume of the Spanish service, appears in Madrid, which is really unlikely for a Philippine-born and Filipino. And so I kind of started following the breadcrumbs through that, and Garcia's name appears, right, in this particular text as the lead illustrator. And it was only through following Garcia that I realized that there was this larger story to be told about this one locally born individual who starts off as an artist, who gets hired at the Botanical Garden of Manila, in part because he needs to help raise his younger siblings, puts aside his fine arts degree and kind of goes in and works in the garden, and becomes really the lead illustrator for the Spanish colonial project in the last decades of the 19th century. And so process-wise, I'm looking at this text for much more significance than I think I had originally gone in. And I was telling Erik this, that, I would spend maybe like 30 minutes to an hour just looking at a plate, figuring what was so different about it and unique at the time. And only after maybe consulting with another art historian was I realizing that Garcia was doing something really artistically different with botanical plates compared to his contemporaries who were producing synopses, the synopsis genre, in other locations, other countries, and certainly other colonial terrain. He's doing things that's allowing him to deploy his sort of fine arts acumen. So if you look at the plate that Erik showed, plants are overlapping. They're kind of there's a 3D element to it, a vibe, a kind of a lushness with the page that's coming out. It's very different from a linear organization of plant life or even insect life that you're seeing in contemporary publications. And this kind of lack of linearity, this ability to show plant life almost as a kind of lushness of the archipelago, I think is speaking to a moment, again, where these texts or these images are communicating a different kind of Philippine flora that's more inviting. And I think is also reflective of Garcia's own knowledge of what's happening in the environment. Yeah, and thank you so much, Orvin, for showing that image as well. Thankfully, in the archive, I was able to find, Garcia's process pics from, sketch to the rendered painting of a similar plant to the actual image that shows up in the synopsis. And you could just see how complex these images are. Risil Mojares, who's a really well-known historian of the Philippines, says that the 1880s is known as this time in Philippine history when we see the most important publications to Philippine nationalism come out, including the Noli by Jose Rizal. I actually think the synopsis is one of those texts, and it's doing this in really incredible illustrated ways that we can continue to read as its own archive.
Thanks for that explanation. There's two discussions in your dissertation that I think it could be useful to share with this group here who hasn't had the opportunity to read it yet, most people probably. You talk a little bit about this kind of the botany of the friars, you might say, or a kind of, and how it's discredited in the global scientific community that's emerging around the turn of the century, if I'm not mistaken. And it'd be useful if you could explain some of that and how you also are rethinking that a little bit. And then also you described this emergent concept of, I'm not sure how it's pronounced. I read it as Malaysia, but it may be just pronounced Malaysia. It's Malesia, as what I think you call it, a floristic region. And so I'd love to hear a little bit about those two things. And then I'll have another question about the floristic region, but I see that we already have questions from the group. So I have a couple more questions and then we'll turn to questions from the group.
Yeah, thank you. And I see you, Kirby. Hi, nice to see your hand. To get onto the question about friars and kind of friar intellectual, botanical knowledge, right? And botanical production. I think in Philippine history, one of the best studied friars who was up to kind of naturalist work is Francisco Manuel Blanco. We study his Flora de Filipinas, which was written and published in 1837, sort of up and down as one of the first texts of Philippine botany. And this is being done both, in the social sciences and the sciences as well. I mean, we're still really investigating his work. And I think it's an important text, no doubt. But what I find really fascinating in the archives is that at least by the 19th century, the Spanish state is really trying to separate itself from the work of the Spanish friars and the work that's being done by secular officials in the Spanish state. I kind of call this more of like a scientific statecraft, if you will. Other scholars have looked at how late Spanish Empire starts to double down and really show its intellectual chops to sort of the new imperial world. This is happening as well in the Philippines with botany. And so at some point, there were some great letters in Madrid covering this. Different metropolitan centers are interested in what the botany that's going on in the Philippines. They're asking for texts that are coming and being produced on the Philippines, and some of them ask for Blanco's Flora de Filipinas. The Spanish state actually comes in and says, yeah, it's good, but that was an Augustinian publication, and now look at the synopsis. Check this out. And this is my hilarious summarizing of it, but I think that's a really important moment, right? This distinction that's starting to happen between sort of friar science and the science of the secular state, and what it's supposed to be doing for positioning the Spanish Empire in a very different way in botany than it had been in the first half of the 19th century. There's much more money going into botany at the end of the 19th century than we've really seen in other parts of the 19th century. When it comes to Malaysia, or Malaysia, depending on how you pronounce it, I think it's a really important kind of floristic region to take note of, because what we're seeing, at least in this time period around the turn of the century, is that botanists are creating a region of their own that they believe is prescribed by plant life, really the movement of particular plant genera across different domains. What they're acknowledging is that this plant genera is moving across colonial terrains. So it's no longer just about Philippine flora versus Dutch East Indies flora versus that in the British Malaya. You're seeing what the flora is across these domains. And so Malaysia as a region starts to gain a lot of credence and salience among these botanists. Why do I find this interesting? Well, I'm a child of area studies. I've been in Southeast Asian studies since I was 18. I've loved the field. And for all of us who are trained in Southeast Asian studies, we know that the apogee is really around World War II. As a field kind of gains social scientific prominence as a result of World War II and eventually Cold War politicking. I'd like to push that, a little bit further back. And if you look at the domain of science, specifically botany, region making was happening well before World War II. And again, I think a lot of these botanists are sort of seeing themselves as standing outside of politics and politicking. But when you look at, again, the sort of inter-imperial configuration that's happening at the time, they're very much part of it. But they're using sort of botany as this explanation for why sort of region making will make sense. And so Malaysia as a place really takes part in that. And it's still considered a floristic subregion of the Indo-Malayan biogeographic zone. So there are presently botanists and scientists within Southeast Asia who are contributing to the Flora Malaysiana catalog and really still seeing it as a concrete place where we can map flora.
Thanks, Kat. This is really fascinating, and someday I'd love to ask you much deeper questions about Malaysia, but I wanted to turn to another part of your dissertation for sake of time. Let's say somebody comes to you and they say, botany, nationalism, I don't see the connection. Can you explain it? You have a chapter in your dissertation where you're talking about the Sampaguita flower, and I think it would be useful maybe to tell us a little bit about what you're doing in that chapter. And remember, most people haven't read the dissertation. So if you could describe what you're doing there, and what is the Sampaguita flower, and how does this offer a kind of window into the confluence of botany, nationalism, floristic regions, all of these kinds of things that you're dealing with?
Sure. Yeah. And then for those of you who have read the dissertation, I'm overhauling the chapter presently, so it's changing a little bit. But thanks for bringing that up, Erik. So the sampaguita, for those of you who might not know, it's the national flower of the Philippines. It's kind of the darling flower. It has a lot of popular significance in the Philippines. And you sort of see it, peddled on the streets of Manila. It comes up in a lot of cultural production presently, both in diaspora and in the Philippines itself. So I'm really curious in that chapter about really kind of taking the sampaguita to task and just questioning for a moment that it's always been in the Philippine imaginary, really trying to locate when it emerges and gains kind of that power, that political valence. And I locate that in the late 19th century, where I sort of start to see, or I'm able to identify kind of at the intersection of intellectual thought in Manila, scientific production in Botany, and cultural production, how the sampaguita becomes this emblem for the proto-nation. And so I argue, kind of in the revision of the chapter, that it does so because of its gendered and gendering qualities that get mapped on to the nation itself, or the nation form. The sampaguita at the time really becomes this stand-in for ideal femininity. She is light-skinned, she's fragrant, she's in bloom, she's in her prime, she's reproductive. Historian Raquel Reyes has looked at sort of this before, and how gender plays a really important role in how the mother country of the Philippines gets developed, specifically in ilustrado or enlightened intellectual thinking at the end of the 19th century. What I think you can add to that, though, is botany and this flower. And I actually would argue that ideal femininity comes by way of looking at a flower as well. And so there's sort of this co-constitution of ideal femininity, the idea of the flower, and how this gets repurposed for creating the archipelago or archipelagic space. Manilan intellectuals at the time are starting to suggest that this flower is ubiquitous. It's everywhere in the archipelago. You don't even have to describe it, because you just have to show it to someone and they'll be able to name it. And they write on it like this, and they're distinguishing it from like the peninsular jasmine. They're saying that it's something very specific that only grows in the Philippines. Botany publications are, producing information on the plant, but if you actually look at the literature, many of the observations around the sampaguita are quite localized. They're in Manila, they're in parts of the Visayas and the central region, and yet it's starting to come into dominance as sort of this popular emblem. And so I think in the late 19th century, that's when it's really starting to take hold, when nationalists are seeing this as a unique subject or object to start mapping, right? And then eventually, the sampaguita gets declared the national flower in 1934, and we've had it since. And so I think having this history is important, especially when we invest, I think, in sort of nationalist projects that take on plant life as emblematic of the nation. And I think there's always a history to this, and never really just an acceptance of the always been, for me.
Thank you. This is so fascinating, this discussion, and going through the way in which even a plant itself can become a new archive into our understandings of nationalism and region. I have a lot of questions, but I know that Kirby's had a question up for a couple of times, and I want to make sure this is a multiple voices come into our conversation. So I'll hold back on my questions and see where we go, and then if we run out of questions, I'll bring some back in. But Kirby, please ask your question, and then after that, I see someone named Chris Pugh also has a hand up. So we'll start with Kirby, and after that we'll turn to Carissa, and then anyone else put your hand up and I'll keep track of the names.
Hi, good evening from Manila. So good morning, early morning now in Manila. So hi Kat, kumusta? I have two questions. Okay, first, you did an extensive study or analysis of Sebastian Vidal Soler's work. How unique is his work compared to an earlier botanist who did the same botanical research in Manila in the late 18th century, Juan de Cuellar? Okay, so how unique is Vidal's work compared to Cuellar? And second, you mentioned, I forgot his name, the name of the Filipino partner or co-worker of Vidal Soler. Would you think that in the 19th century there was this tradition of scientific apprenticeship wherein there's a clear tandem among state scientists or colonial scientists at that time. So even the Jesuits of the Manila Observatory had some native apprentice who did the nitty gritty of work, meaning they did the field work. They were sent to the secondary stations to do the field work, and same with for example the civil and mining engineers who did geological and mining surveys, for example in Luzon. So the likes of Antonio Garcia del Canto, Enrique Abela y Casarego had the service of cartographer Enrique Del Monte, although Enrique Del Monte is a Philippine-born Spaniard, I suppose. So would you think how would you assess that idea of scientific apprenticeship during that particular period in the 19th century? So thank you.
Thanks, Curbs. Hi. I think these are great, very Philippine history specific questions. So I'm happy to answer them, and I'll try to be as general as possible to make them pretty accessible. On the question on Vidal and his difference with Cuellar. So Cuellar is an interesting figure, right? I mean, he's sort of the naturalist par excellence in the long history of botany in the Philippines. I think Vidal is a bit different from him in the sense that Vidal is really deployed to the Philippines towards a lot more institutional building. Cuellar's visit, to the Philippines, his study of flora, and in many ways is also kind of a commercial expedition. He doesn't quite get to the point of institution building, right, as Vidal does for various circumstances. And Vidal is supported by the Spanish state in, I think, a different way than Cuellar is. Right, if you especially think of the late 18th century, where the Spanish state was in terms of developing scientific institutions, this was really kind of the realm of the Royal Society still. But by the late 19th century, you see Vidal not only deployed to the archipelago himself, he's coming with a team of foresters, of botany-trained men from the peninsula. His brother is in the Philippines too, his uncle is in the Philippines, and they're all really taking up botany in a different way, I think. That leads into your next question about training. I wouldn't call it apprenticeship so much, actually, and I can tell you why in the case of Garcia, but training is happening specifically at the Botanical Garden of Manila, School of Agriculture. They actually institute this pensionado program to bring in students from across the archipelago, young men, to study in botany and forestry, to then be deployed back across the archipelago. What's unique about that is we actually credit the pensionado program to something of the United States, right? The bringing of young people from the Philippines to the United States to train, to send them back to the Philippines to take up government posts or teaching posts. This is happening in the Philippines under Spain. It's just happening in a sort of within the colony. And so that training is happening. More men from the peninsula are also coming in, and they're leaving to different parts of the islands. The reason why I wouldn't use apprenticeship so much, though, is because in the case of Garcia, oh gosh, I actually don't even think of him as so much as an apprentice as I think of him in many ways as someone who was able to stay institutionally in place, as a person who was local, who had elite standing, but also had enough connections to kind of stay within the botany institutions and outlast his Spanish contemporaries. Garcia is an interesting character because he's really the longest standing person working for Spanish secular botany through the end of the 19th century. I don't really think of that as apprenticeship. And when you see him come into the Botanical Garden of Manila, he's not trained. And actually Spanish records make many critiques of him for his lack of training. And there's not a lot of effort, I think, to necessarily put him in training or even send him back to the peninsula. This is something he's learning on the job. And then I would say in his relationship with Vidal, when Vidal finally arrives to the archipelago, I consider them equals. Actually, I consider that Vidal's corpus really only takes shape, really only gets off the ground because of what Garcia is doing, both illustrating, his texts, but also helping him go around the archipelago and collecting with him along the way. Vidal dies an untimely death in the 19th century, and it's actually Garcia who is responsible for collecting and organizing his plant life that's in the herbarium, because he was the most familiar with what those collecting expeditions had been. And so I'd love to talk to you a little bit more about, what's happening at the Jesuit Observatory and even sort of the the use of the term apprenticeship, because I think there's something maybe different and maybe similar happening in botany, but yeah, there might be something a little bit more divergent. Thanks, Kirby.
Thanks, Kirby, for such a provocative question, and Kat for such a wonderful answer. Next, we have a question from Cressa Pugh. And Cressa, please, if I've mispronounced your name, feel free to correct me.
Yeah, it's Cressa. Thank you so much. And thank you, Kathleen, for this really fascinating presentation. I have a question which is maybe beyond the scope of your dissertation, so I apologize in advance if it is. But I'm wondering about the role of kind of, or how decoloniality or specifically anti-coloniality appear in your work. I'm particularly curious about, to what extent have there been attempts to kind of unravel these imperial institutions and that you speak of? Have there been attempts to make indigenous claims to the botanical specimens that you reference? I remember a couple of years ago when I was in the Singapore Botanical Gardens, and there were these, pretty significant efforts to rename a lot of the specimens from their, botanical Latin names to their indigenous names, and even replanting native trees to replace plants that had been imported from the colonies. And so, I really saw that as a kind of decolonial move. And so I'm wondering how, decoloniality and anti-coloniality even show up in your work.
Yeah, thanks so much, Cressa, for that question. And it's really coming up much more in how I'm revising towards the manuscript. I think these questions are important because as compelling as sort of this imperial internationalist narrative is, I'm really curious about what's still happening locally, what's being obscured perhaps by Linnaean botany, but is never actually destroyed by it. And so my focus on the dissertation is really looking at that vibrancy of botanical vernaculars. And by vernaculars, I don't only mean sort of linguistically how plants were called outside of Latin binomial nomenclature, but vernacular knowledges of plants that even historians perhaps aren't really looking at or haven't looked at yet completely. And so in a project like mine that's looking at the turn of the century, I'm looking at, for instance, weaving and textile implements, particularly because female weavers, as they were mostly female during this time, really don't kind of emerge in a typical study of botany in the Philippines. And yet their practices were almost entirely plant-based. I mean, these were plant-based technologies where they were relying on, and not just dyes, but also loom technologies as well. And so how do we then read these materials, for instance, as vernacular knowledges of plants that are still thriving, if not expanding during this period, but again, are somewhat obscured by only an imperial botany narrative at the time. I think the Sampaguita work also is important in this, especially if we're thinking about anti-colonial politics that are developing, or at least politics of self-determination that emerged during this period. And I'm also looking, in terms of nomenclature, because that's what she also brought up, at how plant varietals, varietals of rice in particular, and I've mentioned this, I think when Megan was in a different talk, about how rice varietals are abundant in the Philippines, and how, as we currently know it, sort of the Latin name Oryza sativa, right, for rice, existed in the Philippines. Botanists were using that, and yet botanists didn't know what to do with the dozens of rice varietals that had been present, that had local names. And so for me, I'm really curious about the epistemologies of plant ordering that were very divergent from Linnaean botany. Instead of focusing on, for instance, morphological characteristics that define relationship, how are people in the colony at the time using things like touch, taste, feel of rice in the mouth after or before cooking, right? The stage of a rice plant's growth, where it is in its cycle. How do all of those names actually reveal an incompleteness in Linnaean botany? And it's in that incompleteness of Linnaean botany that I think we find a way cooler local history to tell through plant knowledge. So thanks, Cressa.
Such fascinating discussions. Denise Margaret Matias, I believe you have a question.
Yes, so good afternoon, everyone, or good evening from where I am. I'm from the Institute for Social Ecological Research in Bonn, Germany. So Kat, I was just wondering about when you were doing your archival work, whether there was also a list of introduced species. So I'm quite interested, like to map out when did this introduced species such as, Mimosa pudica, for example, the makahiya, come to the Philippines, and yeah, if you've seen that. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I have to credit some of the work of historical botanists in the Philippines that are doing this right now, that are really tracking the introduction of particular species. Domingo Madulin in particular, perhaps the most prolific historical botanist, has been doing this from the early Spanish colonial period. By the late 19th century, we do see this in ledgers of exchange between the Botanical Garden in Manila and other botanical gardens that are present, for instance, in Hong Kong, that are in Singapore and in the Dutch East Indies. It's hard to know, though. I mean, I think I haven't done enough critical work to look at the introduction of particular species, but we do know, at the very least at this time, that there is a much more acclimatization work in place to try to raise other tropical species on the garden grounds. And so those ledgers, they're in Madrid. Denise, if you're ever interested in them, I can even try to dig some up for you to look through that might be able to start placing some of these plants. But I would say the much earlier kind of introduction of plants, you'd have to look maybe at the work of Domingo Madulin. Really, really excellent stuff. But we can definitely talk offline.
Great, thank you. Michael Van coming in from the West Coast as well, I believe. It's good to see you
yes,
again.
Yes, I am. Hey, thank you so much for this great talk. I'm committed sin here. I'm going to admit that I have not read the dissertation, and I'm also going to commit the sin of asking a question that is something that I'm obsessed with in my own research. But is there a discourse on invasive species? Yeah, that resonates with nationalism, and is there also, as a sub-corollary, any understanding of Magellan exchange, colonialism facilitating not plants that are being acclimatized, but plants that are invading it and going out of control?
Oh, so. Yeah, great. Thank you so much, Michael. And hi. That doesn't appear. I can't say that in the texts that I've worked with from that time period, both that are being produced by botanists, but then also among intellectuals who are writing on plant life, they're not really commenting on invasion. They're using that language of plants that are coming in. And certainly not sort of tying back all the way to Magellan is not what I've necessarily found. Although I will say that kind of discourse has come up in a more contemporary sense. I mean, actually tying back to the Sampaguita, right? I mean, the Sampaguita itself is not necessarily a native of the Philippines. It's not endemic to the Philippines, rather. It's actually endemic to South Asia. And so even in the question of nativeness of this plant, right, that sort of gets thrown into the air, in particular with debates about if another plant should actually be positioned as the national plant of the Philippines. And this has happened with an orchid from Mindanao. But this talk about invasion versus nativeness, as you know, Michael, can become really dangerous territory, especially as how plants can be positioned in rhetoric that has been easily alleged against people, right? And so I think even when I sort of think about more contemporary debates and how I place that into turn of the century problems of invasion, although I will look out for it now more in my archive, I'm trying to be a little bit more careful too about how my own work might be positioned for a kind of nativist rhetoric versus an invasive rhetoric that might actually be undoing some of my own kind of politics, I think, doing this work altogether. Also happy to talk about this more if I find some information for you, Michael. Thanks. And I also want to hear about why you're interested in invasion too.
Oh, rats. Just
okay. Rats. Yeah, exactly. Michael has a great
rat guy. So.
Yeah, absolutely. No, thank you for that.
Thanks. I believe the next question is from Al Lim, and then after that will be Max Finley.
Hi, thank you so much for this. I'm in Erik's class, so I had a chance to read this amazing dissertation. And specifically, I'm thinking about measurement. I'm wondering what is specific about the techniques of measurement that locals or botanists use, and specifically thinking about agential realism that's in the chapter 3, the Baradian notion of kind of interaction and the phenomena and collapsing subject object in that sense. So I'm just thinking about how that for the Sampaguita might be similar or different to, for example, the dipterocarp family and the plates that we see in chapter 2? So yeah, would love to hear about that.
Ooh, measurement, huh? Standards of measurement. That's a great question, right? Yeah, and in Linnaean botany, there seems to be what becomes kind of a vocabulary, a shared vocabulary of measurement, right? I mean, these texts are sharing ways of describing plants by size, for instance, and they're able to maybe describe them through Latin. And this is something that's getting shared across empires. And so this becomes a standard way of understanding how we describe plants, right? There is a shared vocabulary, a shared style of measurement. What I think is really cool, though, and I think what you're bringing up around sort of the subject, object, and the possibilities for agential realism is how that measurement of a plant or even the scale of a plant can change depending on the discourse. And so if you look back to chapter 3 and you think back to the Sampaguita and you think about measurement and growing space, right? And how that growing space actually enlarges depending on sort of the imagination. And then, I say imagination, but I mean sort of how intellectuals at the time are both grounding their imagination in scientific texts, but also allowing for a national imagination to really enlarge the growing expanse of the Sampaguita. And then we have sort of measurement turned on its head, right? We actually are inverting sort of the lane, the norms of measurement and plant description and allowing it to become sort of allowing the plant to become much more encompassing of a wide archipelago. And that's a really exciting part, right? How does the Sampaguita itself sort of start to push against these Linnaean norms? So I really thank you for bringing that up, and it's something that I probably should incorporate more in the revision. Thanks, Al.
Max Finley, I think you have a question.
Yes, thank you. And thank you very much, Professor Gutierrez, Kat, for that presentation. I really want to read your dissertation now. I want to read the book even more. So the first question, I guess the first question is, when is the book going to come out? And the second question is, and forgive me if I go on a little bit with this one, I'm very curious, I think following up on questioners 2 and 4, Chris and Michael, about, from a different perspective though, about this internationalizing botany and this creation of floral zones. And I'm very curious in particular, how much of the Philippines, the botanists in both periods who are imagining these zones or creating these zones, how much of the Philippines are they accessing? Is there a geographic bias in the kind of flowers they're putting forward? For example, just because I happen to have it on my desk, I was thinking of the German Travelers on the Cordillera, the translations by William Henry Scott. And he has a few people there, but are they contributing to this international dialogue at all? Or for that matter, are certain geographies such as Ifugao, the Cordillera, or Mindanao being excluded? And to borrow Michael's language, being turned almost into invasive species within it, even though they are very much endemic or very much are parts of the Philippines being included versus excluded? I guess that's the broad question.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, thanks, Max. Fun fact for everyone, I met Max in the UST archives, the University of Santo Tomas archives, back in 2018. So it's just great to see you here again. It's been a long time. When's the book coming out? I have my history colleagues, some of them here in the call. Give me some time. It's gonna get there. Hashtag COVID, but it'll be there. And keep an eye out for it. In terms of internationalizing botany, that I could talk about a little bit more about, and geographic bias. I actually think geographic bias is happening on different scales in the dissertation and how we look at this history, right? Even if botany is internationalizing at the time, the biggest movers and shakers of botany are all sort of imperial metropolitan centers. And so the notion of the international is really only kind of geographically limited to Europe at the time. And this sort of extends to the United States at some point, but it's pretty limited. I think when we're thinking about Philippine flora as well, the geographic bias is mostly Luzon and certainly Manila. These are very well-studied locations for botany up until sort of the early 20th century. There are other investigations that are happening. I mean, there's this extension and penetration of Mindanao that starts around the mid-19th century as well. And its flora is getting sort of considered in this colonial catalog that's building. But I would even argue that, again, much of this colonial catalog is really sort of situated in the colonial capital, radiates outward, and then only kind of decades later is it incorporating other zones. And so you ask, about Cordilleran peoples or peoples in Mindanao, and whether plant life there is sort of getting considered, right? Or if it's being considered invasive, or if there's a particular rhetoric. I actually think during this late Spanish colonial period, not enough is really known. But what is known is the commercial potential of these locations, particularly the timber that's coming out of Mindanao. And that makes it become a much more lucrative place for investigation. But I would say in terms of taxonomic botany, absolutely, there is still kind of this geographic bias up through kind of the earliest decades of the US colonial period. And then that has to, again, lead into questions about, well, what are we considering as part of regional botany as it's developing at the time? What's being constituted as participating in this creation of the regional zone? And how are those limitations being expressed? And that, guys, ties back into Al's question, where does measurement then become a little bit more elastic? Geographical space become much more elastic to meet these intellectual ends.
Thanks. Next question is from Orvin.
Hello, Doctora. So I was really inspired by Chris's point earlier, as was a lot of people in the rest of the comments, and I think a lot of my questions have actually been answered. But I'm thinking, like, just in terms of the dissertation itself, right? Like that sort of narrative that you build with the three sort of like protagonists is, I think, really, really interesting. Is a really interesting way to kind of break through the kind of blinders that we have called 1898, and just kind of create a more nuanced like take on that period in Philippine history. But throughout, I was kind of wondering, like, of the presence of kind of Indio and right, like Indio, like native, as you say, like kind of actors and players. I mean, obviously, like Regino Garcia is like, it's like kind of like a peninsular, or not a peninsular, the opposite of that. Shoot, what is that? Insular. Yeah.
The time, yeah.
Yeah, and he's like an insular, but that's still like within, like, as you said, like the colonial metropole, and even through like the later chapters, as within like the building, like the construction of the Sampaguita as this national symbol, is a very ilustrado sort of move, right? Mm-hmm. Like, and these kind of like anti-colonial or decolonial projects, as it's kind of like a common theme throughout Southeast Asian studies, has a really uncomfortable relationship with, like, really uncomfortable alliance with nationalism. And so kind of wondering, like, is this dissertation just like the lack of Indio voices in this dissertation sort of just like a makes it kind of like a victim of the archive of sorts? Because, right, like, obviously, like, a lot of these letters are written to and from, like, colonial centers to Spain and stuff like that. And secondly, looking forward into into the conclusion of your book, I was reading some really interesting kind of implications of this sort of international botany and sort of like nationalistic or imperialistic science, however you want to call it. That, for example, like, I think you cited one of your works called Imelda Marcos' Toad Lily. I think that's just the greatest title I've seen in work of academia. But I was wondering, like, right, like, what can we look forward to in the future in terms of, or at least future as in like beyond 1945, in terms of what botany played into, like, the role botany played in the Philippines?
Yeah. Oh, what a cool question. Thanks, Orvin. And I love that point about sort of Southeast Asian studies uncomfortable. It was kind of uncomfortable alliance with nationalism. It's what we study, I mean, tell me a Southeast Asianist who hasn't asked this question or like written about it somewhere for a class, or at some point in their own, personal body of work. You're right. You're absolutely right. I mean, these characters, these people had archives to leave. And even then, though, I mean, we have to kind of go back to Garcia. His was much, much slimmer. than Mary Clemens or Sebastian Vidal. I mean, we have his visual archive that I think is the most robust, but even then, I mean, and that slim, lucky by chance resume, to find, in the Spanish archive, but there's not much there, in part because of the destruction that, Manila libraries had faced at multiple instances in the last 130 years. At the same time, I think what you bring up around Indio voices or more local voices of different actors, you're right. Problem is the archive and what's prevalent, whose information or letters are preserved. And even then, there are problems around that in terms of what we're seeing as text and who was able to access text and linguistic production at the time. And the other was really around botany and really who was writing botany. Botany was in Spanish and English primarily, if we're thinking about institutional Linnaean botany. Had I had more time with the dissertation, and this is really the objective for the manuscript, is to become a little bit more methodologically creative going about these sources. And I got to this a little bit with Chris's question. How am I looking at different source materials then for newer archives to bring out other individuals who were carrying plant knowledge at the time? Finding voice can sometimes be a lofty endeavor. I think, giving voice to particular actors, is one that requires a lot of ethical responsibility that I don't take lightly. But when I think of, for instance, weavers at the time who were certainly carrying plant knowledge, I'm pushing myself to look at these different sources, non-textual sources, for trying to map out what that plant knowledge may have been. Another group of actors would definitely be collectors, plant collectors, local guides. These were, by and large, people that were hired in situ to assist colonial botanists and foresters with collecting or with surveying. Local guides and collectors sort of appear in the dissertation, as you're probably familiar with Maximo Ramos, who becomes the main collector for the US colonial outfit alongside other men who are working for the Bureau of Science. Again, and their archives are really disparate. I mean, they're found sort of just mentioned in passing on places like JSTOR Plants, through Clemens' archive, through some of Merrill's archive as well. And so even piecing together their stories, what their life may have been, the different kinds of knowledges they brought into the institutions as people from, a particular location in the colony, people who had decades of collecting experience, those are the kind of actors I really want to bring out in the manuscript. I don't want to lose sight of Garcia. I still think that he's a really important figure to bring out. And I think you also bring up an important point. He's also still kind of more of an ilustrado, insular figure that becomes important even in sort of the story of botany in the Philippines. And so I definitely don't want to lose him, but I hope that sort of answers some of your question for how I might start to think a little bit more about mining different archives for botanical knowledge, where the colonial archive is very insufficient. Post 1945, super interesting time, really cool stuff going on. I've started collecting some oral histories with botanists who trained or conducted research during the Cold War. And what I love, and I'll just kind of give you a snippet here, when I've asked, how did the Cold War impact your research? By and large, they say, it didn't. And so I've thought to myself, like, okay, I'm going to begin the next book by saying the Cold War didn't happen for Philippine botanists. And really dive into where these comments are coming from, because certainly botany was exploding in the post-war period. It was really ramping up even under Marcos. And so the way that I want to attend to this next project is looking at how plants and the scientists who studied them are kind of also partaking in sort of this political project of new Philippine independence in some way. And what I also think is really exciting is kind of taking on the notion of agential realism or plant agency in all of this too. So how do we start to think about plants as sort of being historical actors alongside these plant scientists? And I think that it's a kind of a fun exercise to start to imagine. And I don't mean to say that I'm arguing that plants necessarily have sentient decision-making powers over the actors, that I'm looking at in this time period. But I'm wanting to really push us to think much more about plant growing patterns, plant movement across the archipelago. As people at UC Santa Cruz are really fond to do, is to start thinking with plants, start writing with plants, to allow for a very different kind of history to come out, especially of the Cold War period in the Philippines, as you know, Orvin, that's really been dominated by a particular set of literature that's focused on Marcos I think that's focused really well on domestic and transnational protest, but hasn't maybe done enough yet to look at science and what science is doing. And I know Kirby on the call is doing that too. So I'm really excited about the post-1945 work.
Thanks for all these stimulating questions and answers. We're at about 1 o'clock. Typically, I tell everyone at this time that I'm going to keep the session open for another 15 minutes or so, but I also give permission to those who need to leave at 1 o'clock to do so gracefully. And I just want to thank everyone for being with us until now. But we will continue. We have a few more questions. After about 1:15 or so, I'll turn off the recording and then we can have an open chit chat session as well. So stick around if you have the time, but you're also free to go if you need to. So we have a question from Tri Phuong. Tri?
Hello, Dr. Professor Gutierrez. Thank you for a wonderfully stimulating conversation that we've been having. My question is very brief. I wonder if you could speak to or speak on or share with us how you happened upon or discovered intimately botany as a heuristic and also a modality for unpacking and studying Filipino history, culture, and society. That's all.
Yeah, thanks, Tree. Good to see you. Hi. You know, yeah, I can answer this a few different ways. I mean, I think in terms of my own professional intellectual trajectory, before I entered into academia, I was in public health for many years. And I thought that when I entered into my doctoral program, for those of you who are maybe still in the starting stages of figuring out your PhD project, I thought I was going to work on colonial public health. A good way to begin in that is through medical botany, which becomes a really important facet of Philippine public health. I worked with Laura Nader, who is also an anthropologist, who's worked with Erik a little bit, and he really encouraged me to look at Philippine medicinal plants. That really took me back to my dad, actually, because I had known somewhere down the line he had written on medicinal plants in the Philippines. And so I thought, you know what, let me just ask my dad about the avocado, you know, and like its materia medica quality. And that just started some pretty amazing conversations and discoveries for me and sort of the gaps in literature about the history of botany in the Philippines. The lineage of botanists is very, very narrow. You can really track who learned from whom, especially over the course of the 20th century. And as I started to sort of envision my dad in that lineage, and he certainly is in that lineage, I started to become interested in sort of tacking back, further back to find kind of debates within botany, the gossip, you know, in botany, the really amazing stories that reveal parts of Philippine history, otherwise maybe obscured or not as clearly seen through something like botany in the past. And so it's a very personal, I think, and also intellectual trajectory of mine. And I'm really always, you know, proud of saying that much of my work are like love letters to my dad, for a scientist who I think has been pretty peripheral in many ways, even in his sort of experience in diaspora in the United States. And so I think that's kind of my short, long answer to why botany now, but I think it's still opening up greater investigations again of other plant sciences and other ways of thinking about the environment that are feeling very natural to the progression of this trajectory.
Thanks for that. Harry, go ahead and ask your question.
Thank you, Professor Gutierrez, for being so generous and thoughtful in your exchange with us today. Actually, my question you touched on a little bit in your thinking with Owen around plants as historical actors, but I was wanting to ask a little bit about perspective, because it strikes me that when we look at plants, we kind of can see, we kind of glean alternative or new or different perspectives on cartography, on questions of nationhood, on regionality, and on history. You know, looking at plants teaches us to look at Malaysia and see the kind of relationships that create different grounds for like thinking through history. But also kind of, I've been thinking about how plants, you know, looking at plants teaches us to look at history from the ground up. And this kind of like working like a methodological kind of insistence on like a visuality that's like from below. But then that led me to think a little bit about perspective and thinking about plants not just as objects of study, but as subjects of studying or to study with. Plant knowledge being not something that botanists bear, but that, it being the knowledge that plants bear, like plant knowledge being like plant epistemology. So I guess my question, and I'm struggling to know exactly where to go with this, and maybe it's just to prompt you to speak a bit more about plants as historical actors, but I'm also wondering about whether thinking relationally with plants or thinking through plants as subjects of knowledge can lead to a kind of like, maybe a kind of like unsettling of like the visual as this kind of like mode of kind of like rational domination and like transparent like understanding of history. And like, what is your perspective on the idea of the perspective that, of the kind of like ways that plants can intervene and interact and produce history themselves?
Ooh, yes. Oh, so cool. Yeah, no, thank you, Harry. I think that's, yeah, I can share a little bit of some ideas that I've been sort of teasing through to answer this question for myself. I think it's a very fun one. And I can share and just say too that the kind of the idea of ground up visuality and perspective and methodology is so great. I never thought of it like that. And I think that's, important for work, for how we might start to just, again, undo maybe a little bit more of the human-centered approach, even in a field like history, right? Which I think other subfields of history have done a marvelous job at sort of undoing, right? But when we're thinking about plant agency, I go about this, in one particular way with the Imelda Marcos toad lily. And it's, again, an exercise in just suspending for a moment the idea that humans had control of the entire situation in the discovery, naming, and promotion of this Imelda Marcos toad lily, which had been discovered in the 1970s and named after her. In particular, I'm curious about how this one lily, which is actually only known to grow around Taiwan in southern China, somehow manages to end up at the southern tip of the Philippine archipelago, nowhere seen anywhere else in the archipelago, but is somehow in this location, found among the purported cave dwellers, the Tasaday people. If you're familiar with Philippine anthropological history, the Tasaday were purported to be cave-dwelling people that were discovered suddenly by the Marcos regime. This lily was discovered among them, and it was named after Imelda Marcos to kind of uphold the Marcos's legacy in supporting indigenous peoples. We find out later in history, of course, that the Tasaday were a huge hoax. We discover, of course, that the Marcoses were plundering hoaxes themselves. But I question for a moment, and I wonder that this one plant that's able to jump somehow from Taiwan all the way to the edge of the Philippines in a very, very remote location, somehow participated in the hoax as well. I mean, it becomes subsumed in this kind of laughing stock that the Marcoses become after they're pushed out of office in 1985. And I like to think about that. I mean, how can we think of a plant who's simply working outside of its growing range is also contributing to this? And that's where I think plant agency sort of intervenes a little bit more, when we think a little bit about how, we can create, how plants are sort of actively creating communities of people themselves, right? Ontologically speaking, communities of botanists can't exist without plants, right? How do those constitutions then change over time? How is a particular moment like the Cold War Philippines being constituted in science, not only because of political, social, intellectual forces, but because of the plants that are presented or presenting themselves to botanists too? And I think that's a shift in perspective that allows for a very different kind of storytelling that allows, again, for a little bit of a decentered approach to the human actor. Hope that answers your question, Harry.
Such a fascinating conversation. I'll turn it to Tui for the last question, and then after that, we'll turn to our informal conversation, and I'll stop the recording after the reply to that. Go ahead, Tui.
Okay, thank you, Professor Harms, and thank you, Professor. I'm not sure I can pronounce your name correctly. Thai. Okay, so I'm Vietnamese. I'm not the Philippine Filipinos, and I'm not in like science environmentalist or something. But I have like long time working in the farmer union, so I work very closely with farmers. And I see your research. I wish I read your dissertation, but I didn't have chance. I'm waiting for the book. Um, I have a question about like when I work with the farmers, and I'm interested in developments. Like I care about development. So when I work with the farmers, I talk a lot with the farmers in the Mekong Delta. A lot of them complain about like a lot of like the botany. Like that's very interesting research. Your research about like 19th history or early 20th century, not at the present, not about development. But when I talk with the farmers, they complain about a lot of kind of fish disappear, and a lot of grass, even grass and plants, we don't see anymore in the fields. And I also grown up in the village, so my family my parents are farmers, so my entire childhood working in the gardens. So but about like 20 years now, I don't see a lot of plants, like because of the developments. People don't work in the farms, in agriculture, so they don't have farmers to work in, like to pick the grass like I did before. So they use a lot of chemicals in the Mekong Delta or in my village in the southeast of Vietnam. So do you have like, so and to me like development affect the botany, like a lot of that. And even in my garden now, my mom have to grow grass. Like we have a space and she grows grass. Why we have a lot of grass before. And when I came here, I went to the park. I see a lot of grass that I saw before, and I don't see it now in Vietnam. I only see it in the botanical garden. When I in the Mekong, when I went to the botanical garden, I see a lot of them. I saw a lot of in the botanical garden that the farmers complain to me that they don't see it anymore. So, like, do you have any plan that you do research on like the effect of development on botany in the Philippines or in Southeast Asia? I think Vietnam have that too. So that's just my question about your future plan, because I don't have knowledge about your best expertise, and I haven't read your work. Okay, that's my question.
Yeah, thank you so much, Twee. I appreciate the question. I'm not sure if Megan is still on the call too, but I mean, I actually think that, you know, even if I work in history, I absolutely, you know, find myself responsible to being responsive to contemporary conditions that might very well impact, you know, the environments of Southeast Asia. I only ask if Megan's on the call because I'm making a plug for the Center for Southeast Asian Coastal Interactions, which brings together different disciplines, including history, anthropology, and the life sciences, to attend to these bigger questions that are really confronting Southeast Asia today. Much of the focus right now of the center has been on coastal life, for instance, mangroves, and mangrove degradation, but then also mangrove rejuvenation and ability to regenerate in spite of climatological changes that are impacting Southeast Asia in ways that I don't even have to explain, because I think we're pretty well aware even on this call about what we're confronting right now in the region. I think in terms of a historical lens that I know I'm really excited to try to offer and to continue to build is the question of disappearance and for whom disappearance becomes important. And so even when we think of deforestation that's happening at the turn of the century, the actors that are, you know, writing perhaps the most on deforestation are colonizing foresters who become pretty involved in why timber trees, for instance, are disappearing at such a fast rate, and become much more invested in policing forests in order to prevent, for instance, locals from taking down trees that aren't ready to be felled. And so these questions of development really tie into, well, whose disappearance is being valued, at the expense of what kind of development that's happening at the time. And then, of course, this excavation, I think, as Orvin and others are really trying to really insist on the different kinds of perspectives in relationship to that disappearance. Sometimes it's harder to find in an archive, but I think is still all the more relevant. And you must maybe look, for instance, at different kinds of sources. I think this is where songs, poetry, particular kinds of folklore that we might be able to track back to this time period become important, because then we're able to see what that discourse might be on the fast vanishing forests that become really the preoccupation of colonial botany at the turn of the century. So I hope that answers your question, Twee. We should definitely try to see you at some Seacoast meetings that are still online, and hopefully you can bring your Vietnam perspective too.
Well, thank you, Professor Gutierrez, for such a fascinating and generous and wide-ranging conversation, and for sticking with us for so long and entertaining all of our expansive questions. It's really been quite fascinating. So first, I want to just have everyone join me in thanking you for such a fantastic talk and give you a round of applause.